The phone call came at dawn. Frank Sinatra was still asleep when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Sinatra, it's about Dean. There's been an accident." Frank knew before he even asked. Dean Paul Martin, Dean's boy, was dead. March 21st, 1987, California. Dean Paul Martin Jr., 35 years old, Air National Guard pilot, was flying an F-4 Phantom jet through the San Bernardino Mountains. It was a routine training mission, but something went wrong. The plane disappeared from radar. Search teams found the wreckage hours later. No survivors. Dean Martin was performing in Las Vegas when they told him. He was on stage at Bally's, in the middle of a show. Someone came backstage during a break and delivered the news. "Your son's plane has crashed. They haven't found him yet, but it doesn't look good." Dean finished the show. Nobody in the audience knew. He sang, he joked, he smiled. Then he walked off stage, got in a car, and drove straight home to Los Angeles. He didn't say a word the entire drive. Frank heard the news the next morning. He immediately tried calling Dean. No answer. He called Dean's house. The housekeeper said Mr. Martin isn't taking calls. Frank called Dean's manager. "He's not talking to anyone, Frank. He's just sitting in his room." Frank got in his car and drove to Dean's house in Beverly Hills. He'd been to this house 1,000 times over the past 40 years. They'd had parties here, laughed here, gotten drunk here. But when Frank walked in that day, the house felt like a tomb. Dean was in his bedroom, sitting in a chair by the window, staring at nothing. Frank had never seen Dean like this. Dean Martin, the king of cool, the guy who never let anything bother him, looked broken. Frank sat down next to him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Frank said quietly, "I'm sorry, Dean. I'm so sorry." Dean didn't respond. He just kept staring out the window. To understand what Dean was feeling, you need to understand what Dean Paul meant to him. Dean had 7 kids from 3 marriages, but Dean Paul was special. He was a boy who'd followed in Dean's footsteps, trying to make his father proud. Dean Paul had been a pop singer in the 1960s, part of a group called Dino, Desi, and Amp. Billy with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinch. They'd had some hits, toured the world. Dean Paul was trying to be like his dad, a performer and entertainer. But Dean Paul also wanted to prove himself outside of his father's shadow. So in 1980, he joined the California Air National Guard. He became an F-4 Phantom pilot. He was good at it, really good. Dean was so proud when Dean Paul got his wings. "My boy's a pilot," he'd tell everyone. Dean and Dean Paul had been close. They talked on the phone regularly. They had dinner together. Dean Paul would bring his own kids to see Grandpa. For Dean Martin, who'd been married and divorced multiple times, who'd lived a chaotic life, Dean Paul was stability. He was proof that Dean had done something right. And now he was gone, killed in a plane crash in the mountains. 35 years old. The funeral was held on March 26, 1987, at the Los Angeles National Cemetery. It was a military funeral, full honors. Dean Paul had been a captain in the Air National Guard. He deserved the ceremony. Frank Sinatra was there early. He stood near the back, wearing a black suit and his fedora, dark glasses covering his eyes. He watched as the other mourners arrived. Dean's ex-wives, his other children, friends from the industry, military officers. Then Dean arrived. Frank had never seen Dean look so old. Dean was 70 years old, but he'd always seemed younger, still handsome, still cool. Not today. Today, Dean looked ancient, defeated. Dean walked the front row and sat down. He didn't acknowledge anyone, didn't make eye contact, just sat there, staring at his son's flag-draped coffin. The ceremony began. A chaplain spoke about duty and sacrifice. A military officer read Dean Paul's service record. Fellow pilots shared stories about his skill and dedication. None of it mattered to Dean. His boy was in that box, and nothing anyone said would change that. Then came the 21-gun salute. 7 rifles, 3 volleys each. 21 shots echoing across the cemetery. With each shot, Frank saw Dean flinch. Not from the sound, but from the finality of it. After the guns fell silent, Two Air Force officers carefully folded the American flag that had covered the coffin. They folded it into a perfect triangle, every movement precise and respectful. Then they approached Dean and presented him with the flag. On behalf of the President of the United States Air Force, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. Dean took the flag. His hands were shaking. He held it against his chest like it was his son. And then, for the first time, Dean started to cry. Frank had known Dean Martin for 42 years. They'd met in 1945, two young Italian singers trying to make it in show business. They'd become friends, then best friends, then brothers. They'd formed the Rat Pack with Sammy and Peter and Joey. They'd owned Las Vegas in the 1960s. They'd made movies together, recorded together, lived through divorces and scandals and triumphs together. In all those years, Frank had never seen Dean cry. Not once. Dean was a guy who laughed at everything, who never took anything seriously, who sailed through life with a drink in his hand and a smile on his face. But now Dean was sobbing, clutching his son's flag, and Frank couldn't stand it. Frank walked up to the front row. He sat down next to Dean and put his arm around his friend's shoulders. Dean leaned into him, still crying. Frank didn't say anything. What could he say? Your son's death has meaning? It doesn't. Time heals all wounds? It won't. He's in a better place? That's bullshit, and Dean knew it. So Frank just held his friend and let him cry. After the ceremony, there was a reception at Dean's house. Frank stayed close to Dean, trying to keep people from overwhelming him with condolences. But Dean wasn't talking to anyone anyway. He just sat in his chair, holding the flag, staring at nothing. Over the next few weeks, Frank tried to help. He called Dean every day. Sometimes Dean answered. Sometimes he didn't. When he did answer, the conversations were short. How are you doing, Dean? I'm okay. You eating? Yeah. You need anything? No. But Dean wasn't okay. He stopped performing. He canceled his shows in Vegas. He turned down movie offers. He stopped leaving his house. The man who'd spent 50 years entertaining people just stopped. Frank was worried. He'd seen depression before. He'd experienced it himself after Ava left. But this was different. Dean wasn't just depressed. He was giving up. He'd lost the will to live. Frank tried everything. He invited Dean to dinners, to parties, to golf. Dean said no to everything. Frank sent friends to check on him. Dean barely spoke to them. Frank even showed up unannounced, just to make sure Dean was still alive. One day, about 2 months after the funeral, Frank came to Dean's house and found him in the same chair, still holding that flag. Dean, you can't do this. You can't just sit here waiting to die. Dean finally looked at Frank. Why not? Because you're Dean Martin. You got other kids who need you. You got friends who love you. You've got a life. Dean shook his head. I had a life. Now I'm just waiting for it to end. Frank felt helpless. He was Frank Sinatra. He could make things happen. He could fix problems. He could call in favors, move mountains, make the impossible possible. But he couldn't fix this. He couldn't bring Dean's son back. And without that, Dean was unreachable. The friendship that had lasted over 4 decades started to fade, not because of a fight or a betrayal, because Dean retreated into his grief and wouldn't let anyone in, not even Frank. They still talked occasionally. Frank would call on birthdays, holidays. The conversations got shorter and shorter. Dean was polite but distant. The spark was gone. In 1988, the Rat Pack tried to do a reunion tour. Just Frank and Dean and Sammy, one last time. But Dean dropped out after just 4 shows. He couldn't do it anymore. The joy was gone. Standing on stage, singing and joking, pretended everything was fine when his son was dead. Dean couldn't fake it. Frank was hurt. He understood Dean's pain, but he also felt abandoned. They'd always been there for each other, through divorces, scandals, career troubles. And now, when Dean needed support most, he was pushing Frank away. But Frank never stopped trying. Even when Dean stopped answering the phone, Frank kept calling. Even when Dean refused visitors, Frank kept showing up, Because that's what brothers do. In 1993, Frank organized a tribute dinner for Dean at the Friars Club. It was supposed to celebrate Dean's career, his legacy. Dean reluctantly agreed to attend. Frank hoped it would help, that seeing all his old friends might spark something in Dean. But Dean sat through the entire evening looking miserable. People made speeches about how funny Dean was, how talented, how beloved. Dean didn't smile once. When it was time for Dean to speak, he stood up, said thank you, and sat back down. That was it. Frank saw it then. Dean wasn't coming back. The Dean Martin he'd known, the partner, the friend, the brother, was gone. This was just a body going through the motions, waiting to join his son. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 78 years old. The official cause was acute respiratory failure, but everyone who knew him understood what really killed him: grief. Dean had been dying since March 21st, 1987. It just took 8 years for his body to catch up with his heart. Frank Sinatra was too ill to attend Dean's funeral. He'd had strokes. His health was failing. But he sent flowers, thousands of them, and a note. It said, "Dean, you finally get to see your boy again. Say hello to him for me." Frank died 3 years later in 1998. In his final years, he talked about Dean often. Friends said Frank felt guilty. Guilty that he couldn't save Dean. Guilty that their friendship had ended not with laughter, but with silence. Guilty that Dean had died alone in his grief. In one of his last interviews, Frank was asked about his biggest regret. Frank thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I couldn't help Dean. When he needed me most, I couldn't reach him. That eats at me. You tried everything," the interviewer said. "Trying isn't the same as succeeding. Dean was my brother. I should have found a way. What would you have done differently?" Frank's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, but there had to be something. Some way to bring him back from that darkness. I just never found it." That's the true story of Dean Martin's son's death and Frank Sinatra's helpless reaction. Two men who've been inseparable for 40 years, torn apart by a tragedy neither could control. Dean Paul Martin died in a plane crash at 35. Dean Martin died of a broken heart at 78. And Frank Sinatra died wishing he could have saved his best friend. The funeral, the flag, the tears. That was the moment Frank realized some things can't be fixed. Some pain is too deep. Some losses are too great. And even Frank Sinatra, with all his power and connections and determination, couldn't fight death and grief. What did Frank whisper to Dean at the funeral? Nobody knows for sure. But friends who were nearby said they heard Frank say, "I'm here, Dean. I'm not going anywhere. I've got you." But Frank didn't have him. Not really. Dean was already gone, lost in his grief, unreachable. And all Frank could do was watch his brother fade away. That's the tragedy. Not just that Dean Paul died, but that Dean Martin died with him, slowly, over 8 years. And Frank Sinatra, the man who'd conquered the world, couldn't do a damn thing about it. The king of cool stopped being cool. The chairman of the board lost his oldest friend. And Hollywood's greatest friendship ended in a cemetery with a folded flag and tears that wouldn't stop. Frank Sinatra learned the hardest lesson that day. Love can't always save people. Friendship can't always heal wounds. And sometimes, no matter how much you care, you have to watch someone you love destroy themselves with grief. Dean Martin lost his son. Frank Sinatra lost his brother. And the world lost two legends who never really recovered from March 21st, 1987. That's what happened when Dean's son died. That's how a 40-year friendship ended. Not with a bang, but with the unbearable silence of a man who'd lost everything that mattered.